What if I told you that the night you are about to spend with your new husband could determine the rest of your life, and not just in the way you think? You're a young bride, Margot, barely 15, standing in the doorway of a stone cottage in 1347 AD. Your heart pounds as your new husband, Henrik, nearly twice your age, approaches your marriage bed. The rushes under your bare feet crackle with every nervous step. The flickering candlelight casts a dim glow on his weathered face. His rough hands reach for the leather cord at your throat, and you can't help but wonder, is this what it really means to be a wife? You clutch the rough woolen shift your mother stitched for this night, the same one worn by her mother before her. You hear the drunken laughter of Henrik's friends, shouting crude encouragements and beating pots with wooden spoons outside. They won't leave until they hear proof of your marriage being consummated. With every breath you feel the weight of their eyes, your family's expectations, and the religious doctrines that will judge your every move tonight. This isn't a romantic love story, this is the harsh reality of medieval intimacy, a world where sex wasn't just a personal act, but a battle for survival, family honor, and eternal salvation. Tonight, you are not just Margot. You are the symbol of a tradition that is both cruel and deeply ingrained in a world ruled by superstition, fear, and a desperate need for control. And as Henrik's calloused fingers slowly undo the knot of your shift, you can't help but wonder, what happens if this night goes wrong? This is the world of medieval marriage, where the bedroom is never private, and where what happens between a husband and wife is governed by rules so bizarre they would make modern sensibilities recoil in shock. The concept of marital rape didn't exist because wives were considered property. The Church's teachings cast a shadow over every intimate moment, warning that excessive pleasure, even within marriage, could damn your soul. What did it truly mean to be married in the 14th century? Let me take you into Margot's world, where her virginity wasn't just her purity, but her family's reputation, her father's wealth, and the key to her survival in a dangerous, unforgiving society. The rules of intimacy were dictated by the Church, by ancient superstitions, and by the fear of damnation. In this world, even something as personal as sex could have dire consequences. So what did Margot face as she stood on the threshold of her marriage bed? Let's find out. The room smells of wet wool, damp earth, and a lingering trace of smoke from the hearth. Margot can feel the weight of the stone walls pressing in around her, making the space feel smaller than it is, and the candlelight flickers wildly in the cold draught. Shadows dance across her face, highlighting her youth against the harshness of the night. She steps carefully onto the rushes beneath her feet. Her bare skin prickles as the dry rushes crackle with each step. Every sound seems magnified in this quiet chamber. Every breath, every heartbeat feels like a deafening drumbeat. And outside she can hear the clamor of voices, Henrik's friends drunk on ale, chanting crude songs and beating pots with wooden spoons. But this is no celebration. The noise outside is a reminder that Margot is not just a young bride but a commodity, a vessel for what her father has traded in exchange for 3 pigs and half an acre of barley. Henrik, a man nearly twice her age, is no knight in shining armor. He is a deal made in the shadows of practicality, and tonight he's about to claim his bride as payment for a transaction that has nothing to do with love, but everything to do with survival. The weight of that knowledge crushes Margot's chest as she wonders how she ended up here. She's barely 15, too young to understand the complexities of marriage, yet expected to perform the role of a wife and bear the weight of an entire family's future. She clutches the woolen shift her mother made for her, feeling the coarse fibers dig into her skin, a garment passed down through generations of women who never had a choice. The same shift that has witnessed generations of marriages, each night steeped in the same fear, the same expectations, and now it's her turn. She hears Henrik's heavy steps behind her, the sound of his boots muffled by the rushes, his breath hot and steady. Her heart races faster. She's supposed to be a woman now, a wife, and yet all she feels is the terror of the unknown. This isn't a night of passion, of new beginnings, but a test of her virginity, her purity, her value as a daughter in her father's eyes. If she fails, if there is no proof of her virginity, she will be a disgrace to her family. And so she stands frozen, her palms clammy, her mind swirling with fear and confusion. The weight of the night presses down on her as she waits for Henrik to take the first step. It's not just the physical act she fears, but the weight of what that act represents, the fear of damnation, the pressure of being watched by an entire community, and the suffocating grip of her father's expectations. But this isn't just about Margot. This story is a window into a world where intimacy was never truly private, where sexual acts weren't acts of love or desire, but rituals of survival, honor, and social obligation. A world where the concept of personal freedom didn't exist, especially for women. If you've ever wondered what it was really like for women in the medieval world, this story will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about the past. If this glimpse into Margot's world has piqued your curiosity, if you're as intrigued by the hidden truths of history as I am, then don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments. Let me know what you think about the brutal realities of medieval intimacy, because what happened behind closed doors in those darkened cottages wasn't just about love or marriage. It was about survival, societal pressure, and unspoken rules that still echo in our world today. Let's dive deeper into the history that's been buried and uncover the secrets of an age where every act of intimacy was a matter of life or death. In medieval Europe, marriage was not a sacred union built on love or passion. It was a contract, an economic arrangement designed to secure survival, status, and property. For Margot, marriage wasn't about finding a partner with whom she could build a life of shared dreams. It was a business transaction brokered by her father, who saw his daughter's virginity as a valuable commodity. A dowry more precious than gold, measured not in emotional connection, but in pigs, land, and social alliances. Margot's marriage to Henrik was a prime example of this transactional nature. He was a man chosen by her father for the practical value he brought to their family, 3 pigs and half an acre of barley. It didn't matter that Henrik was nearly twice her age, or that she had no personal connection to him. Margot's role was clear: to serve as the bridge between two families, ensuring economic stability and the continuation of her father's bloodline. Love had no place in this arrangement, only duty, survival, and the preservation of family honor. And tonight, as she stood on the threshold of the marriage bed, the weight of that legacy pressed heavily on her young shoulders. Now let's move to the wedding night ritual itself, an ordeal as brutal as it was public. Once Henrik and Margot were married, the real test began. The bedding ceremony was an event in itself, a spectacle for the entire community to witness. The couple was not allowed to retire to the privacy of their chamber in peace. No, the guests, having feasted and celebrated, gathered in anticipation as they led Margot and Henrik to the marriage bed. It wasn't a time for intimacy or reflection. It was a public performance, a legal formality. The groom and bride were undressed before the guests, their bodies exposed as they were prepared for what was to come. This wasn't about desire, it was about proof. The community waited for one sound, a cry of pain. The idea was simple: Margot's virginity had to be taken, and the proof of that would be heard by everyone. The neighbors, the priests, and all the onlookers had a stake in this moment. The entire village had a claim to Margot's body, and they expected proof that she was pure. A whisper, a gasp, a cry would confirm the marriage as legitimate, and only then could they leave in peace. It wasn't a quiet, intimate moment shared between husband and wife. It was a spectacle that ensured the marriage would be recognized by all. This was a world where privacy didn't exist, and intimacy was never truly private. Every movement, every sound, every action was under the scrutiny of the community. In this society, sexual intimacy wasn't just a personal act between two individuals. It was governed by the expectations of the church, the law, and the community. The marriage bed was not a place of sanctuary, but a battleground where honor, reputation, and social status were decided. The church and society at large had a hand in every private moment, from what was allowed to be done to when and how it could happen. The intersection of public, religious, and community expectations created a pressure that was unbearable. A woman's value, her honor, and her future were all tied to the successful consummation of the marriage, and all of it was laid bare for everyone to witness. For Margot, this was the most terrifying part of the night. She wasn't just marrying Henrik, she was becoming part of a system that stripped her of agency. The public ownership of intimacy, the watching eyes of the village, and the weight of religious doctrine pressing down on her created a suffocating environment where the act of consummation was never just between husband and wife. It was a public declaration, a binding contract, not only to Henrik, but to everyone who had a stake in the marriage. In the medieval period, the church held an iron grip on nearly every aspect of life, including the most intimate moments between husband and wife. Marriage was considered a sacrament, and the church saw itself as the ultimate authority in matters of sexual behavior and marital relations. The teachings of Saint Jerome, a prominent church father, and Thomas Aquinas, the great theologian, became the guiding doctrines that shaped how sexual acts were viewed, especially within the confines of marriage. These men believed that sexuality was a gift from God, but like all gifts, it had to be managed carefully, only for procreation and only within the boundaries set by the church. According to the church, the act of sex wasn't about love or pleasure, it was about fulfilling a divine purpose, the procreation of children. However, even within marriage, sex had to be regulated in a way that preserved the sanctity of the soul. Jerome, writing in the 4th century, famously believed that a man who loved his wife too much, who indulged in pleasure within marriage, was no better than an adulterer. For Jerome, excessive pleasure, even between married couples, was a corrupting force, and it wasn't just the act of sex that was regulated, it was the timing, the positioning, the very nature of sexual intercourse that was controlled by church teachings. Aquinas, writing in his Summa Theologica in the 13th century, laid out a clear set of rules for what was considered acceptable behavior in marriage. Sex was permissible only on certain days of the week, during specific seasons, and in one designated position, missionary. The church firmly believed that the only proper position for sex was face-to-face, with the man on top. Any deviation from this was considered unnatural and sinful, violating the divine order of creation. This wasn't about what brought pleasure or connection to the couple, but about what was deemed acceptable in the eyes of God. Now imagine being in Margot's position, barely 15 years old, about to embark on a marriage dictated by her father's economic decisions. The weight of these theological rules would have been a heavy burden for her to bear. The church's view on sexual pleasure was clear, it was dangerous and corrupting. Any enjoyment derived from the act itself was seen as a sin. The focus was entirely on procreation, and pleasure was regarded as something that could distract from the divine purpose of creating children. For Margot, this meant that every moment of intimacy with Henrik wasn't an opportunity for connection or even love, but a duty, one that she had to perform according to the rigid rules of the church, lest she risk her soul. The church's prohibitions didn't stop there. Sexual acts that weren't aimed at procreation were strictly forbidden. Oral sex, for example, was completely outlawed, as was intercourse during menstruation, pregnancy, or breastfeeding. The idea was that these acts didn't serve the higher purpose of creating life and thus were seen as impure or sinful. For Margot, understanding these rules would have been a deeply personal, terrifying experience. Every act of intimacy with Henrik was governed by this framework of guilt, fear, and divine law. The sole acceptable sexual position for procreation, the missionary position, wasn't just a preference, it was a sacred rule. The church's doctrine on marriage made it clear that sex between husband and wife had to follow these strict guidelines, not out of desire or affection, but because it was deemed the only way to properly fulfill God's will. Anything else was considered unnatural, sinful, and even damnable. For Margot, this meant that even on her wedding night, the act wasn't about her or Henrik. It was about following a script written centuries ago by men who would never understand her, her desires, or the realities of her life. The idea of pleasure was entirely excluded from her world. Instead, everything Margot did in her marriage bed would be measured against the church's doctrine, a doctrine that saw sexual pleasure as a potential threat to her soul's salvation. As Margot stands there, the weight of the night pressing down on her, she finds herself facing an impossible choice. Henrik, despite the church's teachings and the sacred rules of marriage, desires intimacy on a forbidden Wednesday during the sacred period of Lent. According to the Church's doctrine, no sexual activity should occur during this time. It was a time of spiritual reflection, fasting and penance, a time when any pleasure, especially sexual pleasure, was seen as a grave sin. Yet Henrik, driven by his own needs and desires, reaches for Margot, eager to fulfill his marital duties. Margot's dilemma is crushing. Does she submit to her husband's will as a dutiful wife should, even though doing so would risk her soul's eternal salvation? Or does she refuse, knowing the consequences of disobedience could be far worse in a world where domestic violence was not only legal but expected? In that moment, the pressure from Henrik's desires, the overwhelming weight of religious doctrine, and the stifling expectations of her role as a wife tear at Margot's fragile sense of self. She is trapped between the promise of marital duty and the fear of eternal damnation. The question is simple: submit and sin, or refuse and face the wrath of her husband, and perhaps even the community. The Church's view on female sexuality only adds to Margot's anguish. Medieval thinkers, including the Church, believed that women were in essence defective men. According to the medical and religious teachings of the time, female genitalia were simply an inverted version of male organs, as though women were incomplete or inferior versions of men. This deeply flawed understanding of the female body shaped not just medical practice, but the very foundations of social expectations for women. Women's desires were seen as unnatural, abnormal, or even non-existent, as if women were created solely to fulfill their husband's needs. In Margot's world, her desires didn't matter, and the concept of her own pleasure was nearly incomprehensible. She was a vessel, a bearer of children, and her sexuality was a tool of reproduction, not an expression of personal connection. To complicate matters further, medieval beliefs about rape were based on dangerous and profoundly damaging myths. It was commonly accepted that a woman could not conceive from rape because it was believed that women could only become pregnant when they experienced sexual pleasure, a myth that had devastating consequences for women's rights and their understanding of their bodies. Rape in many cases was not considered a crime against the woman, but against the man who owned her, her father or husband. If a woman became pregnant from a rape, the pregnancy was often seen as proof that she had somehow enjoyed the act, reinforcing the absurd and dangerous belief that a woman's pleasure, or lack thereof, was the determining factor in whether or not conception occurred. This toxic and erroneous view directly impacted Margot's understanding of her body and her choices. If she were ever to face such an ordeal, if Henrik were to force her into intimacy on forbidden days, would the community, the Church, or even herself see it as a sin? Would they question her purity, her role as a wife, and her worth? The shame, guilt, and fear surrounding her body were immense. Not only was Margot expected to perform her marital duties regardless of her own feelings or desires, but the very idea of rape, conception, and pleasure was obscured by a fog of medieval misconceptions, where women were blamed for their own suffering. For Margot, the rules of this world were not only about the moment before her, but about a lifetime of pain, silence, and submission. Whether or not Henrik's desires aligned with the rigid rules of the Church, Margot's position was clear. She had no voice in this, no power to say no, and in a world where pleasure was punished and silence was expected, Margot's struggle wasn't just for physical survival, it was a battle for her very soul. Margot, like many women of her time, would have grown up surrounded by medical beliefs that seem utterly bizarre by today's standards. One of the most widespread and terrifying misconceptions was the belief in the wandering womb. According to medieval physicians, a woman's uterus wasn't a stationary organ inside her body. No, it could actually move, sometimes upward, sometimes downward, sometimes side to side, causing all sorts of maladies. If the womb moved upward, it could strangle a woman's heart, or even cause madness. If it moved downward, it could cause death. Women suffering from what we now recognize as hysteria, anxiety, or depression were thought to be victims of this so-called wandering womb, and doctors believed they needed to perform bizarre treatments to force the womb back into its rightful place. The treatments for this wandering womb were as strange and unsettling as the belief itself. Physicians recommended fumigating the vagina with fragrant herbs or even foul-smelling substances, hoping to coax the wandering womb back into position. Some treatments involved carrying sweet-smelling herbs near the body, while others required applying foul-smelling compounds directly to the vagina, convinced that the potent aromas would either attract or repel the womb, guiding it back to its proper location. The idea that a woman's uterus could travel inside her body, causing chaos with her physical and mental state, was part of the larger medical worldview that treated women as fragile, mysterious beings whose bodies were constantly on the brink of collapse. And yet, these strange treatments were a part of everyday life for women like Margot, who had no other option but to follow the advice of the so-called experts, who spoke of their bodies with a mix of ignorance and fear. But it wasn't just the uterus that medieval society misunderstood. Women, particularly in rural areas, often relied on herbal contraception and folk medicine to manage their fertility. Plants like pennyroyal and tansy were commonly used to prevent pregnancy, sometimes brewed into teas or consumed in small doses. These herbs were known to have abortifacient properties, although their effectiveness was uncertain and dangerous. The Church, however, didn't view these remedies as a helpful form of family planning. They condemned them as witchcraft. Women who used these herbs were seen as dabbling in forbidden magic, and many were accused of being witches, subjected to trial and persecution. For Margot, the use of such herbs might have been whispered about, passed down through generations of women who had to rely on secret, often dangerous knowledge to maintain some semblance of control over their bodies in a world that offered them none. But these methods of contraception were not only ineffective, they were often deadly. Women in the medieval period sometimes resorted to more extreme measures, using potions made from toxic substances like mercury, lead, or other harmful compounds. These concoctions were designed to prevent pregnancy, but they often came with a fatal cost. The risks of poisoning were high, and many women died from these dangerous treatments, their lives cut short by the very remedies they turned to for help. The medical knowledge of the time was based on ancient beliefs, yet it wasn't just ignorance that caused these deaths. It was also the fact that women had no choice but to follow these dangerous paths, as they had no legal, social, or medical means to access safer options. For Margot and countless other women, this world of medical misunderstanding and superstition was their only reality. In a time when women's bodies were treated as mysteries to be solved, their choices were limited by a combination of fear, ignorance, and religious dogma. Her life was shaped not only by the expectations of society, but also by the whims of a medical system that often viewed her as little more than a vessel, controlled by forces outside her understanding. And yet, women like Margot didn't simply accept these limitations. In the shadows of medieval villages, there was always the whisper of rebellion, of hidden knowledge, folk remedies, and secret practices that gave women a sliver of control in a world where they were otherwise powerless. In the medieval world, virginity was more than just a personal quality. It was seen as a form of property, a transaction that held immense value. For young brides like Margot, virginity wasn't just a matter of innocence or purity, it was a matter of family honor. Her father had arranged the marriage, not based on affection or love, but on economic advantage. The act of proving her virginity was in essence the payment for that union, her body a piece of currency to ensure the family's reputation and social standing. Margot's virginity was more than an intimate aspect of her life, it was the cornerstone of her family's honor, tied directly to her father's status. The weight of this pressure hung heavy around her neck. To fail, to be found wanting, could destroy her both personally and publicly. On her wedding night, the pressure of virginity was far more than symbolic. It became a transaction that demanded proof. The tradition of displaying the blooded sheets after consummation was one of the most humiliating aspects of the medieval wedding night. These blooded sheets weren't just a sign of physical purity, but a public declaration that the marriage was legitimate. The bride's virginity was not just for the groom to witness, it was for everyone in the village to verify. Neighbors, friends, and family gathered to wait, often outside the couple's chamber, listening for the confirmation of the union. The sounds that followed were often the only proof that the bride had been deflowered, and without this proof there were dire consequences. The stakes were high. If Margot and Henrik did not produce proof of consummation, their marriage would not be legally recognized. It wasn't just about the couple, it was about the community's role in legalizing the union. The medieval marriage was a public affair, monitored not only by the community, but by the church as well. The church demanded that marriages be consummated in a certain way, and the proof needed to be made publicly visible. This meant that the church would send representatives to investigate the consummation, going so far as to inspect the bride's body for signs of penetration. If there was no sign, if the bloodied sheets didn't materialize, the consequences were grave. The marriage would be annulled, the bride could be sent back to her family in disgrace, and she might even face public humiliation or worse. Neighbors and family were enlisted in the process as well. They were often questioned about what they had heard, about the sounds that came from the marriage bed. The community was expected to keep a watchful ear to ensure that the marriage had been validly consummated. For Margot, this meant that even in her most intimate moment, she was not truly alone. The entire village had a stake in her body, her honor, and the success of the marriage. The bedroom became a legal arena where sexual activity was not just a personal or emotional act, but a matter of legal verification. What does this mean for someone like Margot? It means that she wasn't allowed to simply be a bride in the traditional sense, cherished, loved, and given time to settle into her new role. Instead, she was a pawn in a much larger game, her body inspected and judged by an unforgiving system. The pressure of virginity, of being able to prove her purity, of confirming the consummation of her marriage for all to see, was crushing. This tradition created a space where the marriage bed was not a private sanctuary, but a place of public scrutiny, where her sexuality was a legal matter, a matter that had consequences far beyond the bedroom. For Margot, this wasn't about love, it wasn't about comfort or connection. It was about surviving the ritual that determined her worth in a society that valued her body more than her emotions. The world Margot lived in forced her into a mold, into a system where her body was always on display, always up for examination, and always linked to the reputation of her family. She would carry the consequences of her marriage, both public and private, for the rest of her life, and the pressure of that proof would shape everything she was expected to become. In medieval society, the church's authority extended to every aspect of life, especially sexuality. The rules were rigid and unforgiving. For married couples like Henrik and Margot, there was no freedom to explore intimacy in a natural or comfortable way. The church laid down strict guidelines about sexual positions, with a clear preference for the missionary position, where the man lay on top of the woman, face to face. This position was seen as the only one approved by God, the natural order in a world where even the most private acts were scrutinized and regulated. Other positions, particularly those involving any kind of deviation from this structure, were condemned as sinful. Rear entry, for example, was seen as an unnatural act, associated with bestiality. It was believed that any sexual act that strayed from the missionary position violated the very fabric of human nature, making it an act that was not just sinful, but deeply corrupt. For Henrik and Margot, any sexual exploration that deviated from these rigid, church-sanctioned rules would not only risk their souls, but also carry the heavy weight of social and religious condemnation. The church's teachings left no room for individual pleasure or exploration. Sex was only for procreation, and it had to be performed in a way that maintained the natural order. The idea of pleasure, enjoyment, or emotional connection was not just ignored, it was actively opposed by the church's teachings. However, beneath the surface of church doctrine, there was a secret world. In the shadows of medieval society, far from the scrutiny of the church, there were whispers of rebellion, of people finding ways to express desires that didn't fit within the confines of religious law. Medieval literature, particularly the fabulists and French poetry, hinted at this hidden world. In poems and songs, courtly love flourished, and in those spaces, sexual desire was depicted as something that could be romantic, passionate, and deeply personal, far removed from the sterile, procreation-driven teachings of the Church. In these poetic tales, there were descriptions of courtship rituals and sexual positions that directly contradicted Church teachings. Some works even made light of the Church's obsession with sexual purity and its attempt to control the sexual lives of the faithful. But these works were dangerous. They hinted at a level of sexual rebellion that could lead to accusations of heresy or witchcraft. Any deviation from the sexual norms prescribed by the church was punishable, and for women it was a far graver offense. Women in particular were seen as dangerous when they dared to step outside of the church's narrow definition of proper sexuality. For women like Margot, there was always the spectre of the succubus and incubus demons that the church believed could prey on the vulnerable during sleep. These demons were said to seduce their victims, especially women, during the night, drawing sexual energy from them. If a woman experienced vivid sexual dreams or sexual sensations while asleep, it was often interpreted as evidence that she had been visited by a succubus or incubus, which led to terrifying accusations of witchcraft. In the eyes of the church, these women were not just victims of their own desires, but agents of evil, accused of consorting with demons and leading others into sin. The fear of sexual demons became so pervasive that even ordinary women who experienced any form of sexual arousal, particularly outside of marriage or without the approval of the church, were seen as susceptible to spiritual attack, and in many cases these women were burned at the stake. The notion of the succubus and incubus was not simply a part of folklore, it was a dangerous belief that dictated how women were treated and how their sexual experiences were interpreted. The church's moral code imposed harsh limitations on female sexuality, and any sexual experience outside of the prescribed boundaries was often demonized. For a young bride like Margot, the terror of being accused of having sexual dreams, especially in the context of her marital duties, could lead to devastating consequences. The complexity of medieval sexuality wasn't just in its regulation, but in the fear it instilled, the control it exerted over every aspect of women's lives, and the constant threat of condemnation that hovered over those who dared to experience their sexuality in any way the church didn't approve of. As we consider the world Margot lived in, we can understand the tangled web of beliefs, rules, and fears that shaped her every thought, her every action. Her sexuality was not her own, it was something to be controlled, monitored, and guarded by religious doctrine and social expectations. What was private was made public, and what was personal was weaponized against her. The medieval period saw sexuality as something dangerous, something to be feared, controlled, and constantly scrutinized. In this world, even the smallest deviation could lead to ruin. Trompedemic. In medieval society, menstruation was viewed as a mystery, a source of deep fear and superstition. The belief that menstrual blood was not just a bodily function, but a dangerous substance, dominated the lives of women. This belief wasn't merely a cultural quirk, it shaped the way women were treated, how their bodies were understood, and how their very presence in society was controlled. Menstrual blood was believed to have the power to poison crops, sicken men, and even dull the sharpness of knives. Yes, you heard that correctly. Knives were thought to lose their edge when exposed to menstrual blood. The power attributed to a woman's menstrual cycle was more than symbolic. It was seen as an actual threat to the health of the community and the success of the harvest. This view of menstruation as something toxic led to social isolation. Women who were menstruating were often removed from normal life, cast aside during their monthly cycles in a bid to protect the community from the supposed contamination their blood brought with it. It was a common practice to isolate menstruating women in special huts or bleeding huts, where they were forced to live in seclusion until their cycle ended. These women were viewed as unclean, and their presence in public spaces was considered dangerous. They couldn't enter churches, prepare food, or even touch sacred objects without risking contamination. In some communities, menstruating women were forbidden from making contact with the rest of society altogether, not just for religious reasons, but for the fear of spreading the poison within their blood. But the societal fear didn't stop at isolation. It also influenced medieval medical practices, many of which were dangerous and often fatal. When women experienced menstrual disorders, the prescribed treatments could be horrifying. Bloodletting, which was a common medieval practice for all kinds of ailments, was frequently recommended as a cure for menstrual problems. The idea was that by draining blood, you could balance the humors in the body and cure menstrual irregularities. Yet this treatment often weakened the patient and in many cases worsened their condition. Even more bizarre was the idea that sexual intercourse could somehow be a cure for menstrual disorders. The theory went that sexual activity could release the excess blood or even calm the uterus, offering some form of treatment for ailments like irregular periods or cramps. This treatment wasn't based on medical knowledge or an understanding of the female body, but instead on medieval ideas of balance and humor theory, the belief that the body's fluids had to be perfectly balanced for optimal health. If those who were menstruating were experiencing discomfort, the solution was sometimes seen as sexual relief. This misguided thinking meant that women's bodies were not only subject to societal judgment, but also to dangerous medical advice that could cause further harm. For Margot, like all women of her time, this mystification of menstruation was more than just an inconvenience. It was a daily reminder that her body was both misunderstood and feared. The belief that her menstrual blood could harm those around her, that it could even ruin the harvest, kept her trapped in a cycle of isolation and shame. She was conditioned to believe that something as natural as menstruation could separate her from the rest of society, marking her as both untouchable and dangerous during those times of the month. The way society viewed menstruation wasn't just about physical health, it was about moral purity, social control, and the constant fear of female power, embodied in her most natural processes. These fears created a world where menstruation wasn't seen as part of the natural life cycle, but as something inherently polluting and even destructive. The isolation, the dangerous treatments, and the constant fear of contamination kept women like Margot trapped in a system that valued their worth not for their skills, intellect, or humanity, but for their ability to conform to rigid and often fatal societal beliefs. The medieval approach to menstruation was not just about health, it was about controlling women's bodies, keeping them separate, and managing the chaos that was believed to come from within them. In the medieval period, marriage was about much more than love or personal connection. It was a carefully orchestrated contract with the sole purpose of ensuring the survival and prosperity of families. A crucial part of this contract was sexual compatibility, which was believed to determine whether the couple could have children and thus continue the family line. The hot and cold theory of sexual compatibility was one of the most bizarre and scientifically unfounded beliefs of the time, yet it shaped how marriages were arranged. According to medieval medicine and philosophy, the balance of bodily humors, hot, cold, wet and dry, was essential for overall health. This theory was applied to sexual relationships too. A man and a woman were believed to be compatible only if their humors were in balance, particularly the hot and cold humors. If the man was considered hot in nature, passionate and vigorous, and the woman was cold, receptive and fertile, then their sexual union was believed to be successful for procreation. This idea wasn't just a theory, it influenced marriage decisions, as families sought to match men and women whose temperaments and physical conditions aligned in ways that would maximize fertility. For Margot, this meant that her body wasn't just her own, it was subject to the rules of balance and compatibility laid down by medieval thinkers. And for her marriage to Henrik, it was not just her virginity that was examined, but also her physical suitability for marriage. The idea of sexual compatibility went beyond love or desire, it extended to physical attributes that could ensure fertility. In some cases, the couple would undergo examinations before the marriage to determine whether they were physically suited for reproduction. Brides and grooms were scrutinized in a way that feels invasive and personal to us today. Physicians and marriage brokers would often examine the bride's hips to assess her fertility, believing that wide hips were a sign of a woman's ability to bear children. The bride's genitalia were also examined to confirm that she was capable of sexual intercourse. This disturbing practice wasn't just about love or attraction, it was about ensuring the next generation. Even more unsettling was the spiritual compatibility that the church insisted upon when it came to marriage. Beyond physical characteristics, the church believed that couples could be spiritually incompatible, a belief that added another layer of anxiety and scrutiny to the already overwhelming pressure of marriage. Consanguinity, the church's rules about blood relationships, dictated that marriages between close family members were forbidden, as it was believed that such unions would lead to weak or monstrous offspring. Marriages were examined for spiritual kinship, whether the couple had shared ancestors or were too closely related in the eyes of the church. Even the degree of spiritual kinship through godparents or family connections could lead to the annulment of a marriage if it was deemed to be too incestuous or morally wrong. For Margot, this meant that her marriage to Henrik wasn't just a personal matter, it was a public, communal affair. It wasn't enough that her virginity be proven, her body was subject to the scrutiny of both physical and spiritual examinations. Her marriage was an event carefully constructed by her family and the church, not just to ensure her future, but to guarantee the survival and respectability of her entire family. Her future wasn't decided by her own desires, but by the social, medical and spiritual rules that governed every aspect of her existence. Even before her wedding night, her body was already a subject of public and private control, whether it was about her ability to bear children, her virginity, or the spiritual suitability of her union. This was the reality for Margot and countless other young brides of the time. Their bodies were public property, subjected to the whims of family, society, and the church. Sexuality, in the medieval period, was not a private matter, it was a social contract, a power structure that was governed by laws, religious doctrine, and community pressures. The control of sexuality was a tool used to maintain social order and to regulate everything from marriage to reproduction. From the church's restrictions on sexual positions to the public rituals that validated the marriage bed, sexuality was something to be monitored and controlled by everyone but the individuals involved. For Margot, her wedding night wasn't a moment of intimacy or personal connection. It was a performance dictated by the rules of religion, tradition, and societal expectation. Her body was not her own. It was a symbol of family honor, social standing, and religious purity. The laws of the time didn't simply regulate the act of sex, they shaped the way people experienced their most intimate moments. From the belief that sexual pleasure was sinful, to the examination of brides' bodies for proof of virginity, sexuality became a tool for control and subjugation. In a world where women's sexuality was viewed as dangerous and their desires were ignored or condemned, Margot's fears and limitations were shared by countless women across Europe. Their sexuality was regulated, not by personal choice, but by the church, community and law, and failure to conform could lead to everything from social disgrace to death. Yet despite the oppressive control, there was always an undercurrent of sexual rebellion in the medieval world. People found ways to express desires in secret, through illicit acts and hidden cultures that flourished outside the boundaries of religious law. Medieval literature, popular among the common folk, sometimes described tales of courtly love, forbidden pleasures, and sexual acts that defied the strict codes of the church. Folk customs, fertility rites, and underground knowledge of herbs and practices were the silent forms of rebellion, a way for individuals to claim a small piece of sexual freedom in a world that tried to dictate every intimate moment. These rebellions were not just acts of defiance, they were a form of survival, a way for medieval people to navigate the suffocating control imposed upon them. Margot's story, in many ways, reflects these larger themes of sexual repression and resistance. Her fearful wedding night wasn't just a personal ordeal, it was a microcosm of the sexual culture of the medieval period. It reveals how religious, societal and personal factors collided in the lives of women, shaping their experiences of sexuality, love and marriage. Margot was not just a frightened bride, she was a symbol of an entire system of control and fear that governed the most personal aspects of human existence. Her fear, her submission, and her eventual acceptance of a system that saw her body as property speak to the way that sexuality was used as a tool of power, a tool that disempowered women and stripped them of the agency to define their own bodies. But in her story, we also see the resilience of human sexuality, the silent rebellions that took place in the shadows of the medieval world. Despite the efforts to control it, human desire always found a way to escape the confines of social and religious expectations. In Margot's world, survival meant adhering to the rules, but in the wider scope of history, the story of her wedding night is just one example of the many ways in which sexuality as power and sexual rebellion intersected. Her fears, her obedience, and her internal conflict reflect the larger truths about human desire and the struggle to retain ownership over one's own body, mind, and soul. As we reflect on Margot's story, we are reminded of the danger and resistance embedded within medieval sexual practices. The control exerted over sexuality wasn't just about enforcing rules, it was about survival, reputation, and spiritual purity. For women like Margot, every intimate act was bound by fear, fear of religious condemnation, social disgrace, and even the loss of life itself. The constant surveillance of the marriage bed, the rigid doctrines of the church, and the societal pressures that dictated their bodies created a world where intimacy was never private, never personal, and rarely about love or connection. Instead, it was a battleground for control, power, and survival. Yet, even in this environment of intense regulation and fear, there was always resistance. Human desire could not be fully contained by the structures imposed upon it. Medieval people, particularly women, found ways to express their sexuality outside the confines of church doctrine through illicit acts, folk medicine, and secret forms of rebellion. These acts of resistance, while often hidden and dangerous, are a testament to the enduring human struggle for intimacy, freedom, and connection. They show us that no matter how harsh the external pressures, the drive for personal autonomy and connection remains a fundamental part of being human. Margot's experience was not unique. It was a reflection of a system that oppressed women and denied them the freedom to define their own bodies and desires. But in her story, we also see the roots of the ongoing struggle for sexual freedom, for autonomy, and for the right to pursue intimacy on one's own terms. The dangers of medieval sexual practices, fear, repression, and violence continue to echo in our understanding of power, consent, and freedom today. Ultimately, the story of medieval sexuality is not just a tale of repression and suffering, it is a story of resilience. It reminds us that the fight for control over our bodies, for the right to define our own desires, and for the ability to connect with others authentically is an enduring struggle that transcends time. As we look back on these dark chapters of history, let us also remember the lessons they teach us about human dignity and the ongoing fight for personal freedom in the face of systems that seek to control and limit the most intimate parts of our lives. If you found Margot's story fascinating and want to dive deeper into the hidden truths of history, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts. Let's continue exploring the untold stories of the past together.